Big story.
Thanks. And they say you should never become the news, so I'm probably making a mistake here. Welcome to Undocked. I'm Nick Chubb.
And I'm Raal Harris, and we are unscripted, unfiltered, and undocked for you this morning. So, Nick, how are you doing?
Oh, good. I've had a busy couple of weeks, but I'm good.
I had a little holiday, came back, and went absolutely crazy into work, I can imagine, because it's, ladies and gentlemen, we quite often like to get a little bit of a scoop, but I think we've never got a scoop, an internal scoop. So this morning, announced, what was it, about half an hour ago, that
Indeed.
you, Thetius, have acquired the publication Digital Ship. So
very exciting times.
Massive congratulations. Doing deals
thank you very much.
Is never easy. And I can imagine there's a few twists and turns that you probably don't want to share and some that you might this morning. Big congratulations. Big story.
Thanks. And they say you should never become the news, so I'm probably making a mistake here. But it's very indulgent to be breaking it on this podcast as well. But yeah, we've acquired Digital Ship. Actually, we're not actually acquiring it under Thetius. So we want to keep the two brands quite separate, and we want to maintain the editorial independence between them. We think Thetius has done a great job, and the team do a fantastic job at producing research, and it's really got a great name for itself as an independent research provider. But we think Digital Ship also has a great name, and we're really excited to build out the kind of media side of things. So yeah, we're structuring it as a group now. We're at the kind of top level, Antares Digital Group, and Thetius and Digital Ship. And then alongside Digital Ship, we also picked up Vessel Performance Information, which is a small microsite focused on kind of decarbonisation technologies. And the plan is that we're going to turn it into a multimedia platform for maritime technology decision makers, particularly those decision makers who are focused on digitalisation and decarbonisation. And we're going to take the focus away from events for a little bit and just make sure we get the media side really running well. And then we'll be, fingers crossed, up and running within a few weeks and uncovering more and more scoops.
Yeah, that should make it a little bit easier for us to keep up to date with the very latest.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I was reflecting on this when you told me about it, and you'll probably tell me I'm wrong with the dates, but I feel like when I first started in Maritime, and obviously I've always worked on the tech side of Maritime, it was like the publication. It was the big, that's where you went if you wanted technology stories. No one else really covered that. What's your perspective on it, where it is as a sort of brand?
You're right.
Today?
It's got 25 years actually this year.
Wow.
It's its 25th birthday, so it's got a 25-year legacy in the space. And you're right, it's a name that kind of everyone knows. I think it's fair to say, and we're very aware that the kind of product has become a bit unloved over the last few years, and I think the investment in the media content ultimately and the overall platform has been lacking a little bit. So it will change more in the next 10 weeks than it has in the last 10 years. But I actually had a really lovely message from a friend of ours, a CEO of a tech company in the space this morning. He said he used to dream of getting written about in Digital Ship in the early 2000s. So, it's got that kind of vibe to it. And we want to restore that. We want it to become the kind of premier hub for news and content in the maritime technology world. And we think we've got a real chance to do it as well, which is exciting, if a little terrifying.
Yeah, I think publications are really interesting as well as a space. I don't have a huge amount of experience with it. When Videotel was acquired by KVH, they gave me the Crew newspapers to run. The Newslink.
Yeah, I used to get them on board Newslink.
Yeah, did you? $1 a day news, and it was a very sort of established product, and it was a very kind of simple. There was when I started looking at it, there wasn't like a huge amount of editorial thing you could really do because it was mostly picking up news feeds and all that kind of thing. But I was very enthused by the idea of it. I kind of had my sort of Charles Foster Kane moment, from Citizen-Kane. Kind of briefly dreamed that I kind of would sort of be able to sort of shape the hearts and minds of a generation. Empire. But of course, it was it was a very sort of formulaic, in a sense, product. There wasn't a lot of room to do that, so I was quickly thwarted. But I found it sort of really interesting in the sense that you do have an opportunity, because fundamentally you're choosing how the narrative is shaped, right? So you can't change the news, but how you approach it. And the simple editorial line, as you will have experienced as a seafarer when running those newspapers, was that this is an audience that's far away from family, friends. They susceptible, as we talked before about sort of seafarer welfare issues and that kind of thing. They are susceptible to negative news or news that might be pitting one crew member against another.
Right.
Sort of, the editorial sensitivity was there, that we would try to tell, not to ignore bad news or shy away from reality, but to choose to place positive elements to stories. And I found it really interesting. Is that something that you're sort of interested and keen to kind of get your teeth into? Because I imagine that when you started thinking about this, you were really reading the line that they were taking, looking at them against other spaces. You must have a feel already for where you want to take the publication from that editorial standpoint.
Yeah, I think, well, I guess first things to say is we've pulled together a small editorial team to kick things off. We are looking for editorial leadership. If anyone is interested in that, please send me a message. And we're also recruiting for a general manager who's going to come in and run that business as a kind of standalone business. So again, if you're listening and interested in that, then please DM me. I think everything you're saying is true, but then I think the other factor to take into account is how much media has changed in the 25 years that this publication has been running. If you wind the clock back to 2000, social media wasn't a thing. Facebook hadn't been invented. The iPhone hadn't been invented. And so the way that we consume information today is so different. And that's, a big part of our early efforts now are to turn this publication or these publications into a mobile first platform, and probably much more of a multimedia platform rather than just focusing on reproducing press releases. And the other thing that we're really keen on is actually to go out into the industry and get the kind of first person views from those decision makers in senior positions across the industry, who are ultimately the ones who are going to be influencing where technology moves. We want to do a lot of features and a lot more kind of in-depth interviews with senior leaders to try and get under the skin of how they're thinking, and of course to showcase what the most exciting technologies are, because I think we're at a moment in time which I think is quite rare when you take into account what's going on with LeoSat connecting every ship to the internet, what's going on with AI and the conversations we've had over the last few weeks about AI, and then what the industry needs to do for decarbonisation. Is this kind of confluence of three huge technological shifts that are once in a lifetime. And so we want to place ourselves at the center of that discussion and guide the industry to make good choices ultimately. So it's very exciting. And it's also, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking, God, this is actually quite a responsibility. It's making me a bit nervous.
No, but I think what you're saying there is really interesting, because what I'm hearing, the subtext of what you were saying, is sort of opening it up really, so that it becomes more of a kind of community around it, and that is part of that, is getting that community to then sort of be content providers and aggregators for you as well. And that that is a very smart way of doing it, because there's a whole bunch of people out there who are desperate to get their message across, and if it's if those expertise can be leveraged for content generation as well, then it's a quid pro quo, isn't it? It works for everyone. But the other thing that occurs to me that would be different from 25 years ago was that now with connectivity, there's also an opportunity to have an audience on board the vessel as well, which is really quite exciting. Very different dimension.
100%. Yeah, and it's but those, I remember those Newslink clippings being effectively a single page of A4, and you're near enough limited to the word count that you could get onto the ship.
Yeah.
Whereas now we can stream live onto a ship, and so yeah, we're facing a very different world in terms of how information can be delivered.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you think about the people who are sort of at the coalface of technology in maritime, it is that there is that sort of that two actors, I guess, within that. I mean, there's many more than that, but there's definitely those ashore who are looking at trying to manage the big picture stuff at the fleet level, but the increasingly it's necessary for the person on board the vessel to have a really good understanding of what's happening and moving in technology. Increasingly, that's becoming part of the profile of at least some of the roles on board the ship, if not all of them, are becoming increasingly dependent, as we sort of allude to on a regular basis, don't we? The way in which that seafaring is becoming something that's increasingly necessary, to be digital savvy, to be aware of everything from just the sorts of onboard applications that are almost becoming operations are almost becoming kind of dependent on, to the sort of, the cybersecurity aspects of it and all that kind of thing as well. So yeah, really exciting times. And once again, big congratulations. And
thank you very much. But that is definitely enough about me and digital ships. So what have you got from the rest of the maritime world?
It's sort of kind of links, which is nice, I suppose. So it's we're getting it. We're sort of in summertime now. It's sort of holiday period, and people are, I guess, certainly from vendor point of view, it's fairly suicidal to launch products in July and August. So there's not going to be. There wasn't a huge amount of news. There was, I think sort of geopolitics kind of pervades, but I think we're both unqualified to really talk about that to any extent. So I sort of started looking a little bit further afield for sort of inspiration, I guess, and came across the outside of maritime, the World Economic Forum. They have a Center for Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is a nice kind of nice place to be. And they did a report. I think it actually came out in June. I think I'm right in saying it's around the sort of top 10 emerging technologies of 2025. And I thought, oh, this might be good. We can kind of see. And then I quickly sort of thought, no, this isn't actually particularly useful because there's just a lot of stuff in there which is not, which is all fascinating, but is not relevant to our dear listeners.
Right.
On this podcast, there's probably two things in there that sort of rang a bell. One was the green ammonia, and talking about how transformative green ammonia is, and the ways in which to look at that. But that's something that in maritime we're very well versed in. We've sort of talked about that in previous episodes, the way in which as an industry we're backing it. But I think there's kind of two interesting things in there. One, it does reference and does kind of acknowledge in the World Economic Forum, it does recognize the part that green ammonia is going to play towards shipping. But it's kind of interesting because I thought about this sort of double-edged sword, because you've got, on the one hand, a wider application of a fuel like ammonia, an emergent new fuel. You start to say, okay, right, well, if general industry is backing that, if that's something that's sort of likely to take off, then that gives us a stronger indication that, yes, that will be the fuel for a large part of maritime, because the infrastructure will be there. Equally, however, you look at it through the other lens and you say, well, actually, in shipping, we have a tradition of using the fuel that nobody else wants in HFO. And this is one of the things with ammonia and with any of the new emergent fuels. I think it's like, where will shipping stand in the queue for being able to use these new fuel types? So I think that was kind of something that shone through. But as I said, I think we've talked about ammonia before. There's nothing that I don't think that's really new that takes the debate. And it was interesting it referenced shipping, because the thing that really did catch my eye and did get me kind of thinking was one of the top 10 that they called collaborative sensing. So this is really looking at, I suppose, kind of smart cities they were looking at. And so the combination of sensor information from a wide different range of applications, and the examples that it gives from a car perspective. If you've got a car that knows what's happening and around the car, as you've seen with, we've seen that for a long time, haven't we, with things like Teslas and all that sort of stuff, versus sort of taking it to, I think they use a good phrase, collaborative autonomy. The idea that, okay, if the car knows where the car is and what's happening around the car, and it can help you to drive and be self-driving eventually. But if everything is talking to everything, all the cars are talking to all the cars, the traffic lights and everything, you start to kind of get this idea, as I said, sort of collaborative autonomy, where all those different sensors are combining. And with things like smart cities, you can imagine from the point of view of controlling congestion, from safety perspective, huge numbers of benefits. And I was reading about this and I was thinking, okay, clearly there were a lot of kind of new elements to it, but I thought, like, it's strange that they don't mention maritime in there, because we've had this concept in maritime for a while now with AIS and VTS, to aid decision making. But if we think about the idea that they talk about in this report, which is this kind of elaborating on this sort of smart city and beyond idea, it's really not just kind of being able to know where, in the case that we would be interested in, ships, where they are, but vessels, ports, fleets, all understanding the world together in real time. And that's what kind of got me thinking really in this report is not just the idea that we just collect more and more reference data, but we're actually creating a shared awareness, which could unlock all sorts of benefits. If you can imagine, when we talk, you mentioned decarbonisation, the need, we've talked before about the madness of sort of just in time arrivals and what that can potentially do for reducing fuel and energy consumption, all that sort of stuff. But so obviously massive application for navigation, for autonomous operations, that kind of thing, for port coordination, which is one of those really kind of troubling areas in sort of supply chain in terms of, I don't mean troubling, worrying, but I mean, it's a hugely complex part of what we do. Fleet operations, security, then you think about environmental stuff, the picking up of the weather sensor beyond like the vessel itself, telling you what's happening, or the satellite picture, what's the real-time stuff. And then also kind of, when it comes to biofouling and all those color elements as well, all that kind of stuff, massive sort of potential opportunities. And then I was thinking, well, you've got the real-time aspect of what's really happening now and enabling to coordinate and to remove friction in all those different parts of it. But then you've got the, what could we call it? All-time, real-time versus all-time. So all-time being like all the historic data. What does that tell us? And then enable us to be able to predict. So that was something that, as I said, it didn't reference maritime, but it just got me thinking about what that would take.
Have you heard of VDES? The VDES?
No.
Okay, so I would say that is the kind of real world maritime version of what you're talking about. So I'll get my geek on and we'll do a very brief AIS history lesson. So AIS was invented as a ship to ship data sharing system purely for safety purposes. So there was never any intention of AIS becoming this kind of huge global commodities and economic intelligence engine that it's become. It was literally so ships within VHF range of each other could broadcast their position, and if you looked out the window, you could see on the screen which ship you were looking at. Basically, that was initially what it was all intended for. And the next evolution of that has been under development for some time, and it's now getting to a point of kind of critical mass, and it's called VDES, which is VHF Data Exchange System. So where the AIS only publishes or broadcasts the vessel's IMO number or the MIMSI number, which is the identifier, and then a position. It normally does a few bits off the GPS, so things like course over ground, speed over ground, that sort of stuff. VDES, VHF Data Exchange, is the aim of it is to broadcast not just the position, but also the planned ECDIS track. So effectively broadcasting all of the passage plan information for that vessel. And it's been trialed in the Baltic. So the Swedes are kind of pioneering this whole space. And it's being trialed in the Baltics, where you've got ships that have VDES-enabled ECDIS systems that are sailing around the Baltic, and then you've got the VTS, the Vessel Traffic Services team in the port, and also the pilots that have access to this system. And they have the ships just have a beefed up AIS on board that's capable of broadcasting additional information. If you're in the VTS up in kind of Gothenburg or places like that, rather than just seeing the position of the ship, you can see the position of the ship, its previous track, its intended track, what the passage plan says it's going to do, and then the pilots can also see that, and the ships can also see that. So everyone has a real-time view of what the kind of operational picture is for every ship. The future state potentially for the navigator is that takes you from having to kind of speculate about what another ship might do, and if that ship maybe is approaching a waypoint, if you're going to take evasive action to prevent risk of collision, maybe you don't need to take that action. So it's really interesting, but it also raises questions around what happens when we end up with potentially VHF data exchange system aided collisions as well, because you become so reliant on this system that you don't take proper coal regs action. So that's the kind of interesting, very salty mariner part of it. But there's also a wider implication of that, because this stuff is going to be broadcast on open channels in the same way AIS is. That what that might enable, about what you said about the kind of all-time view, is that actually the volume of data that's going to start to be broadcast from ships as this becomes adopted, and I think it probably will get adopted globally in time. It'll take a bit of time to get there, but is that we'll have a very rich picture about what ships were planning, what ships have gone and done, where they've gone, and yeah, much more rich than what we get from AIS.
And what just one thing occurred to me is particularly where you said about assisted collisions there. Where does the radar sort of fit into that? Because obviously the passage plan tells you what's the intention, but the radar should be telling you what, what's likely to, what's the actual track that it's on and what's going to happen at that time. So does that feature in there, or is that kind of
radar is just another tool, and that's one of the big things they kind of try and teach you on day one of trying to become a deck officer, is that the number one tool that you should be using is looking out the window and actually really getting an understanding. You should be able to assess risk of collision by standing on the bridge and looking out the window. That's kind of the first thing that you should be able to do. Everything else should really be a kind of cross-referencing tool. Problems come in when you rely too heavily on one piece of equipment. So that could be on the radar, or it could be on the EGDIS, or it could be on the AIS plot. We now these days have integrated bridge systems where all of those feeds end up on a single screen. And so you can end up with lots of information, but actually no real insight into what's really happening. And some of the most famous collisions, I will say more on the kind of military Navy side rather than the merchant Navy, some of the most famous collisions in recent years have just been that you've got, some officers sat there with their head down, staring at a screen, not realizing that actually something is bearing down on them, and that they should have taken actions.
Yeah.
Radar should, and AIS should. None of them are guaranteed 100%, and even the new systems that are coming online, these kind of autonomous watchkeeping systems, again, I see them as another tool, and they can certainly do a lot of the heavy lifting, but nothing beats looking out the window and assessing it yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, isn't it? It speaks to a kind of a recurrent theme. I think it's probably come up about 3 or 4 times without ever being a sort of a subject in our discussions on this show. It's what's the trade-off between the real benefits of being able to delegate to technology, versus the reliance on the human and the human's sort of ingenuity and diligence and experience, I think, as well. That's really interesting. But that's the thing, just to come back to the point, because I think it's an interesting one about because I remember working on training material for EGDIS when EGDIS was first sort of coming in. And it was that sort of unintended consequences thing of some like you said, somebody then is so compelling, it appears to be such a kind of a clear view of where you are. It's let's stop using it as a chart and actually start using it as the kind of navigational aid, which is which was the wrong take. So but in this case, if you sort of started making a judgment not on what you're seeing, but on what the information is telling you that vessel's going to do, that could be that there'll be all sorts of sort of things that could affect decision making, and then in turn that cumulative effect, particularly in busy waterways, of lots of people then adjusting what they're doing, therefore they then don't do what the systems are telling everybody else that you're doing, is kind of which is why I guess this is the sort of compelling thing that they're trying to say about that collaborative autonomy. The implication, maybe not for ships, but certainly reading the smart cities idea, is that there may be a manual override, but essentially the system is managing however, what everyone's doing. So, I mean, I think there are massive opportunities here for Maritime, clearly, to be able to coordinate the supply chain logistics as a whole, particularly if you put those two systems together, could be incredibly powerful. But of course, there are massive barriers to it. And I think the first of which, obviously, if you're talking about a smart city, you're talking about something that's largely going to be in the jurisdiction of one health and safety executive. It could be even under one sort of mayoral control. It might not even be governmental. It could be, so it's a lot easier to govern that. But if we look at sort of shipping, obviously shipping's much more fragmented and takes international perspectives. What's your view on the kind of, because one of the first principles of this kind of thing would be some sort of data standards. If you're going to start sharing data, the data standards need to be there. And from the sort of port to vessel kind of thing, what's your view on where we're at in terms of standards that everybody could recognize?
So at a high level, there's 2 competing schools of thought here. So just forgetting maritime for a second, there is a school of thought that says we need to create what is effectively machine to machine communication, and that requires some kind of data standard. Or the other school of thought is we need machines to replicate communicating like humans do and be able to share information as sort of as close to that way as possible. So a good example of that is in the autonomous car world, you've got Waymo, who went down the route of saying we need to have LiDAR sensors, which is kind of like a light-driven radar, as well as loads of cameras, and it's made their cars very, very expensive, but they're very, very good at picking up the environment around them. They can see through rain and all sorts of stuff. Tesla, on the other hand, said, well, humans use the road all the time, quite happily, and they don't have, radar-like powers. They just have eyeballs. Surely we should be able to replicate a human-like driving experience autonomously using only cameras. So a Tesla only has cameras in it, and a Waymo has cameras plus LiDAR plus various other types of sensors. That kind of Tesla approach to autonomy has been enabled by AI. And it's essentially building huge data set of kind of monitoring people's driving. Anyone who buys a Tesla, what they probably don't realize is that they are contributing to that data set. The camera is always recording how you're driving, where you're driving, what sort of road signs you're looking at, what's going on the motorway, and all that gets fed back into these models that are teaching these cars to drive autonomously. And the kind of Waymo side of things is you need to get all of this expensive kit in place, and it might be a bit safer ultimately down the line, but it's much more focused on enabling the machine to drive in the way the machine wants to drive, rather than kind of replicating how humans drive. And I can kind of see the same kind of question coming up in maritime, where we've been seeking data standards. You take one area like noon reporting, or you take foul convention reporting for sending data from the ship to the port. We've been seeking data standards for that stuff for a long, long time, and we've never really got round unified standards that work for everyone. If there are 3 standards, then we say we need a unified standard. What tends to happen is we end up with 4 standards, and it just becomes more fragmented. So the kind of AI-driven argument against that is to say, actually, we don't need that. We just need a layer of AI in the middle that can think like a human does and can translate your standard into another standard, and that's how the kind of data exchange gets facilitated. Or there is the kind of, we need to have a proper data standard in place here type of approach. And I can see that the frustrating thing is we're probably around the world, we're going to get those 2 different competing approaches happening in various different places, whether that's, particular flag registries, whether that's particular ports that go down one route or another. And I think it's probably going to end up being a little bit messy. But in time, 10, 15, 20 years time, I think we will end up in a situation where the kind of world you're talking about, where you've got collaborative autonomy between lots of different systems and sensors, I think is very, very possible.
Well, yeah. And we talked about, I think it was 2 or 3 episodes ago, we talked about whether perhaps AI has the answer to real-time interpretation of data and being able to deal with some of that difference in the data standards. But there's also commercial aspects to this. Most of the stuff that you're talking about that's assisting, navigational assisting, most of it is vendor supplied. There are different flavors of it, whatever. And we've been spectacularly unsuccessful as an industry in sort of coming up with one way of doing things, getting all the vendors to agree on one, because in part it's because they want to be able to differentiate their products, right? So there's no point them getting into a game where everybody agrees on a limited set of segments. And I'm thinking here about coming back to the Actis example, the S mode.
Yeah.
The idea here, I'm sure everybody will know this, but the idea being that everybody could revert to a mode which was the same across all the different suppliers of the manufacturers of Actis, because it's I only know about this from the training world, and the fact that there's mandated type specific sort of training, or type that was always a bit cloudy, but certainly type specific training is required, because they all have a slightly different take on those core elements which are common to all of them, like the different modes that you can put the Actis in, and the way in which safety contours are constructed. So there are common things that are required to be a type approved, but then the vendor takes over and sort of has their own take on how it's done. So again, there, I think that's another potential barrier as commercial, not just the kind of regulatory side of it. And again, I think with the regulation, I don't want to beat regulators up, because I think it's a very difficult job, especially when technology is moving so fast. But if you think about Actis, by the time the Actis got on board the ship, most people had a something on their phone, which was more impressive by way of navigational electronic charts. Yeah, it's sort of slightly problematic. The other big thing is connectivity, of course. That's the other thing. But there is increasing options on that and fallback options on that. So connectivity increasingly not becoming an issue. I think the other big one, of course, I mentioned ports, is cybersecurity. And this was a story that I was going to bring up the other week, because obviously where you've got this interface with ports, that's perhaps one of the biggest areas which would benefit from this kind of digital ecosystem or collaborative autonomy. But ports are increasingly becoming a target as well. And there was a policy brief issued by NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, the acronym CCDCOE. Why you would put that as your acronym?
Fit well into maritime then.
It just trips off the tongue, doesn't it, that one? But this talks about, obviously it's not a maritime publication. So this is talking about the risk, the maritime risk. Reports becoming an increasing target by state actors. And it names Russia, Iran and China. And access control systems and vessel traffic management systems were identified as the main reported risks. And in fact, I saw in Splash about 2 weeks ago that Singapore had faced a major cyber threat, the Singapore port. So that, again, coming back to this idea of sort of like, let's delegate more and more, control to these systems because they're safer than human beings, the idea being, but then the risk amplification of the risk going higher and higher and higher at that point. And of course, with ports and with volatile cargoes and all that sort of stuff, it's not difficult to see why NATO would be interested in that as a major source of threat.
The other interesting thing about that as well, from a kind of human perspective, is that the more an autonomous system takes over, the more we tend to switch off as humans. And therefore, when something like that goes wrong, the more quickly you need the human to intervene. But over time, as the human switches off more and more and also loses the skills to be able to intervene, you end up in a position where the human possibly can't intervene at the right time and take the right action. So it actually puts a huge onus back onto training to make sure that anyone who's responsible for a ship operationally is equipped with the right skills, not necessarily of how to drive the ship, but how to intervene and when to intervene when driving the ship driving itself, I should say, goes wrong. And I think that's something that we just do not really consider when it comes to things like STCW generally. There's still a mandation to do paper chart work, which is so far beyond the reality of today that it's a bit farcical.
Yeah. And there was another story, I think this week as well, I saw about AIS and GPS spoofing as well, and a lot of vessels appearing even like, in crazy positions. And that's to your point as well, having the seamanship skills to understand when the equipment and know that the equipment is wrong, is not doing what it should be doing. And that is essential seamanship. And we've talked about in the past around what should a sort of cyber attack drill sort of look like, and how are people able to respond and work out when their communications are down and when they're denied certain elements that they've come to rely on of operational systems and that kind of thing. So yeah, interesting topic. The one, though, that I wanted to, I've sort of come away from it really, but when we talked about vendors, and it's not purely a vendor issue, the idea of data sharing, because fundamental to this kind of concept of collaborative autonomy is that we're all sharing data, that we're, like you were just saying there, you're being explicit about your passage planning.
Yeah.
But a whole lot more besides, that would be dependent on this, that we'd been sharing. And I think this is a really interesting area to talk about, because for me, that is a frontier. It is a mindset, a cultural shift, because we could probably talk for an hour on the subject of data sharing and on, the benefits of data sharing or what it would take to be able to sort of do that. Because I think everybody wants the benefits, but it's, nobody wants to show their own, right?
It's like taking your clothes off in public.
Yeah. But I just wonder, because I know you were running with Thetius, you were running some of these sort of round tables with technology leaders and stuff like that. Was that a subject that came up very often?
It's interesting because we run an IT cost and performance benchmarking service, and part of the requirement for that, obviously, is that the CIO or the IT director has to do two things. One is they have to give us all of their budget data, categorized across about 50 different areas. And then two is they have to have our team go in and run an end user survey where all the end users, so on board and ashore, can openly complain about everything that's wrong with IT. And actually what we found is really interesting. There are two types of CIO when we approach someone about doing this. There's the type that say, yes, 100%, we're in, we want to do it, we want the information, we want to improve. And there's the type that say, absolutely not, there's no way we're going to share this information with you. And there's two very distinct camps. It's either one or the other. It's either the easiest sale in the world to get someone onto that program, or they're just never going to do it. And then we have the slightly awkward ones as well, where, you know, you have a kind of a CFO who really wants to do it and a CIO who really doesn't want to do it. But we've found generally that once you make it easy from a practical standpoint, I think people talk about data sharing generally being a barrier. I think often the actual barrier is making the data sharing easy. And so the way that we've got it set up, we've got kind of standardized templates that people can fill in. We can take people's raw data and sort of put it into our template as well. And so we do it. We end up doing a lot of the kind of legwork on getting everything together. And so it becomes relatively easy for them to share. I think often a hesitance about sharing is that you might either share the wrong thing, or you might share it in the wrong way, or you might share it in a way that shares it further than you were expecting to. So I think setting very clear boundaries about what's being shared, where it's being shared, and how to actually go about it, what's the process that would make it work, actually removes 90% of what I think is the kind of fear, uncertainty, and doubt around data sharing.
Yeah, I wonder though whether there's also this thing about data as being, you know, valuable gold that you don't necessarily want to share.
I think it's a perception that people have, and people have had over many years. And I think it kind of came out of there was like in the kind of, I don't know, 2010 to 2015, there was lots of people kind of walking around on stages saying data is the new oil and all this sort of stuff. And yeah, I understand that data is valuable. Did you? Okay.
I think so, yeah. I think it was a line I pinched off one of our guys. Yeah, data is the new oil, but most of it is unrefined.
Nice, smooth. Okay, well, you said it very smoothly.
I pinched it, but it was good.
I get the sentiment behind it. Data is valuable, but it's not inherently valuable. If anything, it can be a bit of a liability if it's not kind of well looked after. Data only becomes valuable when it's shared and transformed into some kind of insight that supports decision making. So you can sit on all of this data if you want and kind of silo it away in your organization or silo it away in your business unit. And you may think you're kind of harvesting value, but until it's used to make a better decision than you would have otherwise, it has zero value. And I think that's the thing that a lot of people missed back then. And that's why everyone was like, oh, my data is valuable, I don't want to share it. Whereas I think some of the more forward-looking IT directors that we work with these days understand that data is valuable when it's shared and when it's pulled and transformed and turned into some kind of actionable insight. So whether it's shared internally or externally is kind of besides the point. If you're not finding a way to derive insight that supports decision-making from the data, then it just becomes a cost.
Yeah.
What's the point in having it?
Well, interesting debate, and one that I just wanted to alert you to, because I think I mentioned before, I'm a member of this London International Shipping Week Innovation Working Group.
Yes.
London International Shipping Week, I'm sure all our listeners should have heard of it by now. It's a sort of big biannual. Does that mean every 2 years or twice a year?
I think that's every 2 years.
Anyway, this one's every 2 years, and so I'm chairing the decarbonisation one on that. And if we get a minute, I'll tell you what we're doing, or we can tell you next week. But there is one on this which I thought was interesting in the context of the discussion, so I'm going to bring it up here. It's called "Breaking the Code of Silence: Maritime's Data Dilemma Roundtable Debate." So this is going to be moderated by Nusrat Ghani, who is
nice. She's great.
Yeah, she's the Madam Deputy Speaker, former shipping minister. So she knows the industry very, very well, and she's obviously very au fait with politics, and so she's going to be moderating. And then there's speakers. There's Richard Buckley, who's the founder of 90% of Everything. Patrick Verhoeven of the International Association of Ports and Harbours. Thomas Nordberg, MD of the Swedish Club, and Ben Palmer, who's president of Inmarsat Maritime. And so that promises to be a really interesting thing, because what they're going to do there is there's going to have an Oxford Union style kind of debate around the merits of sharing data and opening up data standards and stuff versus not. So I'm looking forward to that, because I think this is an area which I think is really pivotal, and it's an increasingly important. Well, let's put it this way. I think for us to really go forward and take the industry forward to the promise of technology, I think there has to be some sort of agreement on how data is shared, not least in the example that we've given of collaborative automation.
When and where is that if people want to get involved?
Well, people can find it online, can't they? I can't do everything for them. No, I did. I have got it somewhere here. Maritime's Dilemma. Where is it? I think it's a morning of Tuesday, the 16th of September, 8 till 10. And it's at the Inmarsat are hosting. So it's at their building, 50 Finsbury Square. That's happening there. And then the same day is an event that I'm doing as well. I mentioned on decarbonisation. But maybe we could do a little sort of walk through to London International Shipping Week every week. Maybe I'll talk about that event next week.
I've got some stuff to plug. Can I plug some stuff?
You can plug some stuff.
So Tuesday afternoon, the 16th, once you're finished with that fantastic sounding debate in the morning, at 3:00, we are hosting a short kind of, well, it's not even a half day, kind of quarter day conference where we're going to go through the kind of key emerging technology trends in the maritime industry across digitalisation and decarbonisation. We're doing it in partnership with our friends at Seatrade Maritime News. So it's at the Informa building. And we're also going to launch the Thetius 150 at that event, which I don't know if I'm pretty sure you've seen it, Raal, but anyone who's not seen it, it is our annual ranking of the 150 most innovative organizations in the maritime industry. So it's 50 startups and scale-ups, 50 small, medium enterprises, 30 corporates, and 20 not-for-profit and government bodies. And it's always very popular. It's always pretty controversial, but we always get a lot of messages from companies who weren't included in it. But it's well worth a read. And if you want to see it launched live, then join us on the Tuesday. And then on the Thursday morning, we are hosting a small breakfast briefing on maritime M&A. So basically how to go from kind of idea to exit in the maritime sector. We're hosting that with DAC Beechcroft, the law firm. That one's invite only, but if you're interested in it, then send me a message and I'll should be able to hook you up if we've got seats.
So yeah, so you and I are up against each other on Tuesday afternoon.
Are we competing?
Yeah, because I
got in there first.
They're all registered, but yeah. No, I'd love to have been at your one, but I'm
likewise.
I'm hosting. I'm calling it Strictly Decarb.
I'm
basically
nice.
I'm taking taking a look at was it three levers to decarbonisation, because a lot of the decarbonisation chat kind of gets on. It always gets a bit stuck, I find, because it starts being about like, oh, but the infrastructure isn't there. We don't know what the fuel of the future is going to be.
Yeah,
and it becomes this kind of like dark night of the soul where everyone's kind of like going round and round in circles. Whereas I'm sort of determined that we kind of just say, well, look, just looking at what we have now, right now, we talked about in episode 1, that amazing feat that Odfell actually managed to do the voyage of 2050. So we know it's achievable. There are other levers there. So we're looking at hardware, we're looking at operational excellence, and then we're looking at sort of regulatory or legal or business. No, sorry, I think we call it business practice sort of levers. Okay. So it's a combination of regulations, obviously things like contracts and things like that. And things like Blue Visby, very exciting stuff like that. So yeah, we've got a cracking lineup of speeches. Ours is starting, I think, 4 o'clock, 4:30, something like that, at the Inmarsat building.
Nice.
Yeah, and we've got some great speakers there from industry. So, but a great example of LISW and the difficulty in navigating it. So, I mean, I'll just mention this because I think a lot of people have been messaging me saying, "What should I do in London International Shipping Week? Where do I start?" Because if you go and look, and you go onto the website, you can look, and there's hundreds and hundreds of different events on there. And I always go back to them and say, what are you interested in? What is it that you want to learn? Because there's no one track that's going to really work for everybody. And so when you're looking at it, obviously, apart from anything that you're doing, what would your advice be on how people should navigate LISW?
It's a tricky one. Simultaneously, what I love and hate about LISW is that there's no There's no trade show, so there's no like floor to walk where you can go and kind of see interesting things happening. But near enough, any area of niche interest you can think of, there's an event of some description going. And some of the events are that, you end up doing really small, like 10, 15 people roundtables that are really interesting and are, across something super, super niche, right through to the big dinner that has, I don't know, something like 5,000 people attending or something. It's sort of insanely large. And so it kind of caters for everything and everyone. My advice would be, if you want to attend, definitely start planning now and work out what you want to do. And then just bear in mind that because there's no central location, it is across London and you will need to move from one place to another, and no one takes into account the travel time. So you just kind of end up kind of late for everything. And so definitely just have a think about where you want to be and then where in London those things are, and kind of how you can get to them. There seem to be as well this year loads and loads of kind of fringe events as well that aren't like part of that official lineup of a few hundred or whatever it is events that are happening. And so I think it's going to be even harder this year to unearth the real gold, but definitely start planning now. We've started putting our event stuff out, and I know lots of other companies are as well. So you've got August basically to come up with an action plan for the week.
Yeah, but bear in mind as well, I think that a lot of the venues are quite small, and they're in a huge number of tickets. Some of them are invitation only, or you have to request parts. It's a good idea not to sort of just hang around. And then, I remember I've always put events on every LISW, and you'll get an email the day before saying, any chance I can get in on this event? And you're like, well, the waiting list is already like 40 people or something.
Yeah.
So don't hang around. And I think that your advice there about the looking at the travel time is really important as well, particularly for those visitors from out of the UK, perhaps don't know London quite so well. You do need to think, because things are happening in the east of the city, right the way across to Westminster, and that could take you. Transport system's great, but that could still take you 40 minutes to kind of complete that journey or something like that. So you can't do things that butt up against each other.
Take a taxi or an Uber.
No, exactly.
Just take the tube. I can't. Every time we have a few American clients, and they're over in the UK occasionally, so I always try and meet them for lunch in London, and they're always like 20 minutes late. And they always email saying, "I'm in the back of a taxi. We're not moving." And I always say to them, "Never take a taxi. It's just you will be late."
Indeed. So I think anyway, look, so LISW is coming up. I think maybe next time or the time after that, we can maybe talk about the some of the other things that catch our eye and try and help people out a little bit. But the calendar's there. The descriptions are pretty good. Decide what themes you're really interested in, and then the other thing I always look at is the speakers. Who have you got speaking there, because there's that's usually a pretty good indication of how well organized it's going to be and how well thought through. Try to avoid the generic as well. That's my other sort of piece of advice as well. Is like, if the themes are just too broad, then you're very unlikely to get anything other than the sort of superficial view that you can hear at any old event. So I think I tend to look for things that are a little bit more niche. But anyway, with that, I think we're probably out of time, aren't we, Nick?
I think we probably are.
And you've got a new magazine to run.
I've got a busy day ahead. Ahead. Keep commenting, liking, subscribing. I feel like I say this every week. I'm probably a bit of a broken record. And if you've not followed on Spotify or Apple, then what are you doing? Weirdly, we've got good numbers, but most of them aren't following or subscribed.
Well, numbers keep going up and up and up. And the thing is, we're yet to have anything other than a 5-star review. So it just goes to show that being unscripted, unplanned, and certainly undocked is the way to go. So with that, I'll say goodbye.
Bye all. Thank you.